And welcome to the Striving for Eternity Academy. We are sorry for those of you who are watching and going, hey, you're about 10 minutes late. Yes, we know. I set up the hangout and was missing for some reason the start broadcast button, which basically meant we couldn't start. So those of you who are watching, you got the memo that there was a new link. And there will be on the YouTube video while we're doing live, there is a chat that you can comment on and we can see. You can also join the Hangout itself. Actually, I will put that, if I can, I will try to put that in the description itself so that you can just, if you want to join, look in the description of the YouTube video and it should have the link to join in there. If not, you can jump in the chat and we have the link in the chat. So for those who may be new, what are we doing? Well, what we are doing is that Striving for Eternity Academy is an academy that we have during the year. It is something that we are teaching many different classes. We've right now in the middle of our school on world religions and giving Christian responses to the different religions. But it is Christmas and New Year's, and we've taken a little bit of a break. In really what it is, it's a break for me doing the show prep because, well, basically, I've been writing the next syllabus on Systematic Theology 4, Book 4, and starting the next syllabus on which we're going to probably do a Bible survey, go through all 66 books of the Bible. In 1 week, no. Some of you know better than to know that there's no way I would do that. But we are trying to get through that and kind of give an overview of all the books of the Bible. So that's the next syllabus that I'm working on. But in the meantime, during the end of the year at Striving for Eternity, we kind of shut things down, try to wrap up for the end of the year. So we figured we'd just do some hangouts, some question and answers. And we did one last week, and at the very end, young Mr. J decided he would start up a discussion on end times. And so we said, well, why don't we talk on end times, which Big Joe Conkle has been begging me for a very long time to discuss, and I keep putting it off and saying Book 4 of Systematic Theology and we will cover it. So he's been waiting and waiting. There's like, what, 60-some classes on Systematic Theology, and he's been waiting. So the wait is over. We'll touch on it. We won't cover it in detail. But we figured it'd be fun for, we'll start off with Jay and I going back and forth a little bit. We have a little bit of a different view. But when any time, and then we're going to open up to other questions and answers from those who are in the chat. So there's the links to join the chat. I suggest you join. So what I'm going to say this, when we look at end times, okay, anytime we start looking at the study of end times in theology, the one thing you want to make sure is that you realize that we don't have things as clear as we would want them to be. Okay, now I happen to be a dispensationalist, and one of the things that dispensationalists are known for when it comes to end times in some seminaries and all are all these charts. Now, if any of you have seen them, I have one somewhere. I was going to pull it out and show this long, I mean, it's got to be like 3-4 foot long. It has all these little details of every single event that supposedly happens in the future. And although that really looks great, yeah, the future is not as clear as the past, and that's one of the things we always have to remember, okay? We have to remember when we look at past, we have to, we can see clearly what's already been fulfilled. It's the future that, not as clear as we pretend it is. And some do pretend to think that it's super clear, but the reality is it's not. And with that, we do have to just realize that as we look at end times, there's going to be some things that there's going to be some good points that a post-millennialist make, an amillennialist make, a premillennialist will make, and there's some passages that are just difficult to deal with. And this is in every camp. So there's three main camps that I just mentioned, right? Premillennial is the idea that there will be a gathering of the church before a literal 1,000-year period. Post-millennial will be that the church is gathered up after a millennial, and the idea of amillennial is that we're kind of in a millennial kingdom, and it's not really 1,000 years, it's just a long period of time, and then at the end, that's when the church would be gathered. That's a very, very broad definitions. But with that, when we look at each of those camps, we have to be aware that every one of those camps have problems. They have passages that are going to be difficult to deal with, and there's going to be passages that are going to be their strong suits. So, Jay brought up one that he wanted to go over, and my one I'm going to go to is going to be in Daniel chapter 9, and we're going to look there. But Jay brought up one, and that's Revelation chapter 20. So we're going to start in Revelation chapter 20. And I know better than to bring up my Logos on the same computer that the Google Hangouts are having, because then you don't hear anything. Jay is holding up his Bible. See, I have a Bible too, Jay. Jay's holding up a Bible. Oh, I'm sorry, Jay. Hold on, Jay. You need me to get more, Jay? Hold on. I could keep reaching. I could, actually, Jay, he's just, and for those who can't see, Jay's holding up Bibles trying to show off how many he has, but the reality is if I turn my camera right up there, actually, I should do that. Here you go. You want to see some Bibles? Top shelf right up there.
Impressive.
That's nothing but Bibles. And as my wife says, with that many Bibles, I should be the holiest man on earth, right? The problem is you actually have to read them all and follow what they say. Ooh. Right. All right, so Jay, let's start off. You were bringing up some points with Revelation 20 in the last hangout, so let's start there.
Can you hear me, by the way? Can you
Can
hear
you
me
bring
at
up
all?
your mic? I'll bring up your mic as much as I can. Say
Okay,
something.
I'm trying a new microphone that I just got.
You're
Here,
just trying a new mic. Yay.
How about now?
All right,
How's
that
that?
sounded better. Okay, so
Okay.
let me read the passage that
Wow,
we
that's
have in
really loud.
question. And this is, when we talk about a millennium, this is the passage that we would turn to, is the first 6 verses of Revelation chapter 20. So if you have a Bible, which you should, but grab your Bible, Revelation chapter 20, and you can read along with me. I'm reading out of the English Standard Version, or as the Reformed guys call it, the Elect Standard Version. It says this, Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven holding on his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, the ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit, and shut it, and sealed it over him, so that he might not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be released for a little while. So then I saw thrones, and seated on the thrones were those who were the authority to judge was committed. Also, I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God, for those who had not worshipped the beast or his image and had not received the mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reign with Christ for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. Over such is the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years. So in those 6 verses, we have 1,000 years mentioned 6 times. Now, Jay, take it away with what you started with last week.
Oh boy. Well, first of all, I wanted to say that I was kind of curious whether or not we would go here first because I think um, Revelation being, prophetic language and all that the I'm sure you realize this, that the clear ought to be interpreted by the unclear ought to be interpreted by the not so clear. um, but I'm going to go ahead and give you what my perspective is on these 6 verses, and consequently the rest of the chapter, really. I think that the millennium represents what is commonly known as the church age, where we have the death of Jesus in AD 33 or so, the destruction of the temple in AD 70, and then the church age continues until the second coming of Christ and the great white throne judgment in the latter half of chapter 20 of Revelation. That's about it. Did you want me to get into like specifics of where I see that in Revelation, or what?
No, I mean we could probably go through that, and I've just realized I made the one big faux pas on video. I'm wearing a striped shirt. I just recognized that. You should never wear a striped shirt on video because it really messes with it. All right. But this is going to be a key verse, though, right? When we look at a millennium.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one of the things I mentioned in the hangout we did last week, a good friend of mine, Matt Slick, would take a different position than I would on this. And I wish I set up a camera. If Chris Honholz was watching, you should join in and let everyone know what I witnessed. Matt Slick and I at his kitchen table, starting into a discussion on end times. I should have turned the camera on and recorded it because it was funny. He was like the proverbial kid in a candy shop. If you ever seen a kid get super excited in a candy shop, that was Matt. It was like, oh, wait. He's like printing documents off and like passing it around like, let's all study this, let's look at this. It was hysterical. One of the arguments that Matt makes is that everywhere in the scriptures where you see the word 1,000 years, it's always figurative. Okay? So let's take the 3 passages outside of Revelation 20 and examine those, and he's right. Okay? You have Ecclesiastes, you have Psalms, and you have 1 Peter. So first off, and actually one thing Matt says usually is a mistake is he'll say everywhere 1,000 is. And we do see the word 1,000 used literally, but 1,000 years outside of Revelation, the 3 times that we see it, it is figurative in all 3 of those. Okay? So that's one thing, like Jay mentioned, you don't take something that's hard to interpret and interpret that first. We take that which is easier to interpret. And that's one principle of interpretation. Another principle is that we don't take things we take things in their literal sense to interpret things that would be in a spiritual sense. So you want to take that which is literal first. Now, I would make the case that Jay's going to disagree with me, and so would Matt, that I think this passage is literal. Okay? And I think, therefore, it isn't the typical type of speech we would see in figurative type language. Now, there is much of the book of Revelation that's like that. However, we don't see that throughout all of the first couple chapters. First 3 chapters are very literal historical narrative. So I wouldn't take those and say, well, we can't interpret those in a clear sense because, the rest of the book is apostolic in that in that sense of Revelation being very figurative. Okay. Now, here's the thing. When we look at this, I will grant you that every time outside of this passage, 1,000 years is figurative. Okay, it's used in 2 passages, Ecclesiastes and Psalms, where it is in poetic language. In 1 Peter, it says to the Lord, 1,000 days is a day is to Lord is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years to a day. So that's 2 references in one passage. So there's only 4 times outside of Revelation 20 that the word 1,000 years actually shows up. All right. Now, if these 6 times are literal, then there's actually more evidence for this being that more of them are literal. So one of the things we don't want to do, though, is we don't want to say because 1,000 years is figurative in these 3 other passages, it must be in this one. Okay? So I hope that's fair enough. Okay, he's nodding his head.
Yes, I'm nodding my head.
Yeah, and if I'm saying he's nodding his head, it's only because those who watch on YouTube may not be able to, they don't see the smaller videos that we have. At least I don't think they do.
Nope.
So here's the thing. Now, Jay, you brought up this question of the pit, bottomless pit, the chain. Is the chain literal, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the same thing that Matt had challenged me with. And here's the thing. Could demons be literally chained?
Well, it depends on whether or not they're physical forms or not. They have physical forms, whether or not they're spiritual creatures or if they're physical creatures, I guess.
Could you have a chain that could be used on an immaterial being?
It wouldn't be a literal chain then, would it?
Sure, it could be a literal chain that is one that is unlike anything we know of, correct?
I suppose so.
Okay. So but here's the thing. Is his main point when he's speaking literal, is his main point is he literally seeing these events? In other words, he's being given this vision where he sees an angel come down from heaven and holding a literal key. So what he literally sees is an angel holding a key.
Yeah.
And he knows, I don't know how, that that's a key to the bottomless pit. And he sees a great chain. So the thing is, that's what he's literally seeing, and that's what he's describing. Okay?
Okay.
He sees the dragon, and I know Matt Slick has a hard time with this because it says, well, it's not a literal dragon. Well, the dragon we clearly know is a name for Satan because the text actually tells us. The dragon, that ancient serpent, the devil, and Satan. Right? So 4 different ways to describe the one person.
Yeah.
Okay.
I got that, yeah.
Okay. So all of that is what he's literally seeing, and then it says, and he's bound for 1,000 years. So we see this. I see nothing in here that says that dictates, though, that it has to be figurative. Even though we might know that, demons are angels that don't have a physical body, and we can't conceive of a chain that would hold an immaterial being. However, depending on your view in Genesis 6, by the way, in Genesis 6, hold on, I'm just going to mute Jason there. Sorry, Jason, muted you because we had feedback. In Genesis 6, depending on your view, and by the way, Matt Slick, and when we were discussing this, Matt holds to the same view as I do, that in Genesis 6, the Nephilim were demons. So if you hold to that view, then you hold to a view that demons can somehow take on a physical form.
Okay.
If they can, then a chain can hold them if they're in a physical form. So the point there being is that when we talk about angels, if we're going to try to base it, if we're going to base whether this is literal or figurative based off of the nature of angels and the nature of the chain, I think that might be missing the point.
Okay, yeah, because I think the main point of contention is that the amillennialist, or at least me, I think that this either happened in AD 33 or AD 70, which then the church age happened, because you have um, Jesus saying in John that now is the ruler of this world cast out, or the ruler of this age, however you want to translate that. I think it's Ionios, I'm not sure. But the idea is that since the 1,000 years are now, Satan was bound a while ago, and he's being released for a little while, and all of that happening. But uh, can you tell that I'm not good at this? Huh?
That's okay. And for those who are watching, Jay, because people may not, you give an air of more maturity than your actual age. How old are you?
I'm 17.
Okay. So for folks who want to give them a hard time, did you know? Would you be able to get onto a Google Hangout and discuss this at 17? Just saying. I know I couldn't.
Well, and I'm probably not doing the best job of it right now. Anyway,
No.
I tweeted you earlier, and I said, before we even come into this, I need to get you onto covenant theology. So.
Oh, I didn't even. Sorry, I didn't even see that. Sorry.
No, that's okay. We already said we were going to do this. So.
But okay. So AD 33 or AD 70.
Or whenever Jesus was crucified, yeah.
Okay. So either the crucifixion of Jesus or AD 70. Why do you choose that one?
The destruction of the temple and the fulfillment of the Olivet Discourse.
That's right. So now here becomes one that and I know that this becomes a controversial passage. Okay, for some. But turn to Daniel chapter 7. Sorry, Daniel chapter 9. Okay. Now here, in the context, the first 19 verses, he's praying. He starts off actually just to give context to this. Daniel is reading Jeremiah. Jeremiah mentions that Israel would be in captivity for 70 years. Daniel's kind of going, well, gee, it's been about 70 years. We should be coming to the end of this. He's taking those 70 years quite literally, and that's his whole argument, or his whole prayer, is because those 70 years were 70 literal years of captivity that he was in. And he knew they were coming to an end because, well, he was, at this point, he probably was in his 80s. Or at least close enough to that 70-year period when he's writing this. Now, in verse 24, he gives us this basically view from his time still in Babylonian captivity to the end of time. Okay? In Daniel 9:24 to the end of the chapter. And the reason I always turn to this one is because there's only two views I think you can have in this passage. Okay? It's either that verses 24 and following are all figurative, or it's all literal. The reason I always go to this is because in this passage, what I find in a lot of amillennial writings is that amillennials will say that it talks about 70 7-year periods. Okay? It says 70 weeks. The week, it just means 77s in Hebrew. That's literally how to read that. 77s. And the idea is a 7-year period, which in Jewish thought is perfectly, it's a perfect way of thinking, because that's how the 70-year captivity is, because Israel did not keep every 7 years there was supposed to be a jubilee in the land, and Israel did not keep that for 70 times. And so because of that, they spent 70 years in captivity for the 70 missed 7-year or 7th year jubilees, okay, where they're supposed to let the land rest. In other words, they didn't trust in God on that 7th year to let the land rest. We now know that was actually better for the land. They didn't. But for those 70 missed 7-year periods, this was the consequence, the Babylonian captivity. Okay? So just to give context to this. Excuse me. Sorry. So we now have 77-year periods that he talks about. Okay? So it's a total of 490 years. All right? And he breaks it up into 3 periods. So looking at this, Daniel 9:24 says, 7 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint the most holy place. So he's saying that there's going to be 77-year periods, at the end of which it's going to be an end to sin, atonement for iniquity, and it's going to bring an everlasting righteousness. Now, I would say there's only 2 possibilities for what that could be. Either the end of time, or it's going to be when Christ either died on the cross or rose or ascended, somewhere in that 3-day period. Right? Because and this is where people end up having a difficulty, because the way most people interpret this is actually the end of time. Okay? He says that, that in verse 25, know therefore and understand that from the going of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of the Anointed One, a priest, there shall be a seven weeks. Okay? Then for 62 weeks he shall build again the squares in the moat from the troubled time, and after 62 weeks an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing, and the people of the prince who is to come to destroy the city and the sanctuary, its end will come with a flood, and the end of it shall be of war, desolations and decrees. And there shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week shall put an end to sacrifices and offering, and on the wing of an abomination shall come one who makes desolate until the decree end is poured out on the desolator. So, here's the idea that you have here. You have a 7-year period and a 62 7-year period. Most people will take those 2 time periods literally, because we actually can date those, right? The timing of the decree, there were actually 3 decrees for Israel to return from Babylonian captivity, to return to their nation. Okay? Each of those times they were given decrees to rebuild the city. Only once where they were to rebuild the temple that we know of. There may have been more than we have recorded in Scripture. But when we look at that, the issue is that from those different decrees, it was about a 49-year period that they figured, the building took, at least of the temple, from the decree to build the temple until the first decree of where that happened till its completion. Now, if that was literal, well, the 62-week period puts us right before, it's either right before the time of Christ, okay, either before his birth is one of the dates that it leads to. Some people have actually done the dating where they have the 62 weeks being right at his entrance into Jerusalem on the Palm Sunday, what we call Palm Sunday. And so what a lot of people would argue is they see that as very literal. Now here's the thing that I end up seeing as a problem, though, is when most of the people that take an amillennial position on this take the first 69 weeks literally as literal 7-year periods. And then this last week that's mentioned, they take figurative, or at least the last half a week. Some people, some amillennialists, will take the first 69 weeks literal. They have it ending with the baptism of Christ. And then at the baptism of Christ, they see that then a 3.5 year period as the first half of that last week of a covenant. And so the question I always end up asking, and I've really never gotten a good answer from anyone on it, but the thing that I look at with this is, if that's the case, then what about that last 3.5 week period? Why do we take that as figurative? And really where it comes down to is it's because the systematic theology dictates the interpretation of the text in that case, at least by most of the amillennials. Now, there are some who will just take the whole thing as figurative. If they take the whole thing as figurative, then they don't have the problem, right? I mean, because it's not a literal, 69 7-year period, and therefore if that's figurative, it's not a problem. Okay? But what do you do with that last week? Now, and you mentioned dispensationalism and covenant theology. That's a big can of worms for some that may not be familiar with it. We do have on our YouTube channel a hangout between Matt Slick and myself on that topic. We also have one with Pastor Paul Kaiser on New Covenant theology and dispensationalism. Between those two, you get an idea of what some of the differences are. But in short, as a dispensationalist, I don't have a problem with this passage being literal completely. And the reason why is because in verse 26, if you look through this, there's time factors. It'll say, and then after this, and then after this, after this. But he says, he'll say, like in verse 25, then for 62 weeks he shall build again the squares of the moat, but in the troubled time. And then verse 26 says, and after the 62 weeks, the anointed one will be cut off. So where I would end up seeing is where in Old Testament theology, I would see a gap here. That because of my position that I think God is going to still deal with Israel in the future, this is a promise to Israel, and something we see often in prophetic, Old Testament prophetic promises. You'll see things that have referenced the first coming of Christ and the second coming of Christ, and they'll be right next to each other. And we often look at that and go, well, we, having hindsight, know, well, one is the first coming of Christ and one is the second coming of Christ. We have no problem with that, because we end up understanding those two differences. Okay? I think this is a similar thing. This looks to be one passage, but there could be this gap that we see in verse 26, that when the Messiah is cut off, that stopped the period with Israel that will start up sometime in the future, and then there will be that 7-year period that's still future to us, but the next stage for what God is going to do with Israel, and then will be a 1,000-year period. That's how I would end up taking this. And a big reason why I turn here, like I said, a big reason I turn here is because so many people will take this passage and the 7-year periods as literal all up until the last week. And my challenge is always to go through this and say, well, what in the text that we have in Daniel 9 would, because if something's going to be literal, there's got to be a reason to suddenly switch to figurative. And so in this case, I don't see any reason, any justification from the text that says, yes, this is literal, 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 figurative. And so since it doesn't say that, I think it's all literal. It's 70 literal 7-year periods. It's just 69 that are fulfilled and one that's still future. Do you at least see that, Jay?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not saying that you have to agree with me. And I want to bring Joe Conkle in, because he's been wanting me to discuss this a lot. He's been begging for it for a long time. So I want to know if there's specific things you are looking for me to answer with that.
No, I mean just keep going. I mean it's good to hear. I mean this is stuff that I've studied a little bit, and it's good to hear someone so I can amen someone, you know.
Oh, cool. That's what I needed, someone to amen me. So if
I'll be the amen guy.
I don't want to get, it'd be really embarrassing, losing a theological debate here with, 17-year-old. I'd be in trouble now. But here's the thing: if Jay brings up a point that he's right on, I'm going to admit it. So, I mean,
there was a book that I had that was in the fire, but I hadn't read it. It was a book by Sir Robert Anderson called The Coming Prince, where he calculated from the time of the decree to rebuild the temple to the time of Christ. He calculated the days, and it was the exact day. That's when Jesus had said, "Had they known this day, they should have known the Messiah was coming that day."
And I'm trying to remember. I wonder if he's the same individual. I remember when I was going through Daniel 9, studying through Daniel 9, and I'm going to date myself. It was before Jay was born.
Yeah, it's an older book.
So, but I remember my pastor gave me a couple of books on Daniel 9, and there was one thin little book that I don't remember the title or the author, and he quoted someone else who had done all the calculations, and I don't know if it's the same individual.
It's a book still available. I haven't bought it again yet, but it's Sir Robert Anderson's The Coming Prince. I believe that's the name.
All right. I'm sure before we're through, someone in chat, I think Christine's already looking it up. She's head down typing. I'm betting she's already Googling it and going to post a link soon, right? But so do you at least see, Jay, where I would come to she's just posted it. So I will post that link in the YouTube for folks. Folks that don't know, Christine's very quick on stuff like that. So, I didn't get the full link. Sorry about that. So, Jay, do you see at least where, when I look at those two passages, Daniel 9, Revelation 20, I'm going to look at those and I'm going to take them literal. And I think that the text is literal. Mm-hmm. I don't see it as a problem. So I don't think that these are difficult to understand. We may not understand everything, I grant you that. But did I at least give you some things to think about?
Well, sure, yeah. I was, while you were sort of describing your position, I was thumbing through Kingdom Come by Sam Storms, trying to look at his interpretation of it. Because he's an amillennial, or amillenarian, I think I've heard that name too. But I was looking through it, and he kind of gave a chart, and he presented first the dispensationalist position, which I think lined up with yours pretty well, and then presented his position, what he called a far superior reading to the dispensational position. But I'm not exactly sure how to go into all of that because it's got like 10 different parts, and it's complicated.
It's good, yeah. Here's one thing, and this is, and everyone's guilty of this. Okay, so I'm not going to give Sam Storm a hard time about it, but anytime someone usually says, "Well, this is a far superior reading of something," that's usually someone making an argument that we're just gonna put aside whatever position we just explained. We're putting that completely aside now. I mean, it is a thing we always have to be aware. I mean, you see this in the media all the time. If you want to see examples of it, you'll see them with words just kind of reject everything that was just said. Or I used to see a guy that used to do presentations. Brilliant. If you don't know what you're talking about on a presentation, this guy was the master of how to do a presentation when you had no idea what you were talking about. He'd present things, And then he would use he'd use language like this. Well, you can clearly see, and then he explained something. And what the effect it has on the room is that no one wanted to actually ask a question, because he would state it as if, like, if you can't see this, you're obtuse. You're just an idiot. And it was funny because I'd see a room full of engineers and people wouldn't want to ask questions. and I'm like, you're not explain this clearly, and like, no one knows what you're talking about. He wouldn't even know what he's talking about, but he fooled everyone. So that aside. So
I did have one question, though, because you said that there was a gap in between the 69th week and then the 70th week. I was wondering, where in the text you would locate that gap, or where it says that the gap. You might have said something in passing, but I can't remember.
There's nothing in the text that clearly. The issue being is when you see so going through this, he says in verse 24, 70 weeks are decreed. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So he starts with that. He says in verse 25, he gives the first seven weeks. Then he says, then. Okay, so this conjunction is one that we'd see as connecting for time. So it's one event, then immediately following another event. Okay. So here you have the 7-week period being immediately followed by the 62-week period. But in verse 26, he doesn't use the conjunction of then that we have in English as then, but he uses and after, okay, which is afterwards, sometime following. And so where I would end up going there is I would see where it says and after, I would see that as the gap that I'm talking about. So it's and after the 62 weeks, the anointed one shall be cut off. So the anointed one, I think we all agree, would be Christ. That's the term Messiah. Anointed one, many people don't know that we think of Christ, but the term Messiah means anointed one. So when you see an anointed one, this is and Messiah, or and Christ, shall be cut off. Okay. Then you see and the people, the prince comes, so it's talking about the people then. So when you end up going after this 7-week period, okay, he's then using the conjunction of and this, and this, and this. So these are the things that are all happening after the end of that 2nd-week period. So you have the 62 weeks. After that, you have a 7-week period, and that 7-week period is including this, and this, and this, and this. So I would see the fact that the language of the text saying the and after is where I would see the gap. And so what's the and after? And after those 62 weeks, which is following the first 7 weeks, so that's 69 weeks, the Messiah is going to be cut off, and it's just a series of things that are going to happen. The Messiah is going to be cut off. Then there's going to be this after this period, there's going to be a 7-year period covenant set up, and then there's all these things that are going to happen in that during that week, and then after that week. I would say the after the week is stuff we see in Revelation chapter 20.
So the church age then would be that gap, correct? Or at least
say again. The church age would be.
The church age would be that gap.
Yeah, and this is, again, you mentioned the differences we'd have with covenant theology and dispensational theology. For those who are new to those terms, a covenant theologian would hold to the church and Israel being, for the most part, the same entity. Okay, maybe two different administrations, but that the church...
Yeah, two different covenants, yeah.
Say again?
Well, two different covenants, yeah.
Yeah, two different covenants, two different administrations, but the same people.
Yeah.
Okay. And a dispensationalist would not. I would see national Israel as national Israel, and God dealt with national Israel under a covenant that was different than he deals with the church. And even though we are God's people, And even though not everyone that was national Israel and had to obey the laws of national Israel, they weren't all going to heaven. Okay, so they weren't all what we would call spiritual Israel, where
Yeah.
the church would be spiritual Israel
Mm-hmm.
because we're all believers. And so the idea of spiritual Israel, you're going to see this in Romans 6, Romans 9, this
Yep.
idea of not all Israel being Israel, that there's a spiritual Israel. So you end up seeing an idea that, basically those who are believers are called spiritual Israel in both
Yeah.
covenants.
Uh-huh.
Okay. So the difference being is I would end up seeing the difference being that God is going to deal with Israel as a nation separate than he does with the church. So when we talk the church age, we both are seeing the same time period. The time after Christ, it's just going to be a difference of when does it end. I would say it ends with, Christ, starting to deal with Israel again and taking the church out of the world, what we call the rapture. And you might see it more as just the end of time, as before the final judgments.
Mm-hmm. What was I going to say?
I don't
Oh, I
know.
was just going to say that I suppose you could call me a bit confused that the gap between the 483-year period of time between the fulfillment, the beginning of the fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy, and the whenever you say that ends with the baptism of Jesus or Christ's death and resurrection, and that now the nearly 2,000-year period, it just seems like there's too much there, time-wise.
Well, but you have that same
The
gap.
gap is longer than the weeks themselves.
Do you
So
have the same gap when you read in Isaiah? You'll see him refer to both the first and second coming of Christ within the same passage at different times. I don't have off the top of my head the passages. I'll try to look them up.
it's that already not yet. Is that what you're trying to?
Well, there is an already not yet that many people talk about, but what I'm talking about, let me see if I could pull up. Let's see if while we're talking, I'm going to try to pull up a picture, if I can find it real quick, that I just recently created to put into the book, the syllabus for the class on that we're doing. So when I was working on the academy, I had to come up with a way of drawing this out. And so with that, I kind of drew a picture. And if I can find it really quick. But it's the idea basically of this idea of having, if you're looking, say you're looking at a mountain, okay, a mountain range, you end up having where, you might see there could be two different mountain ranges. Good, here we go. Let's see if I can bring this up. A picture is worth 1,000 words, so they say. And my wonderful drawings are probably worth nothing. But let's see. How do I view it? Sorry, this is the advantage of switching to Windows 10. Now let me share screen. There we go. Okay, so if you look at this picture, all right, that we have up, what you see here is the idea of, from the perspective of the little guy standing there, he's looking at the mountaintops, okay? Now there is a gap between those two triangles, which are supposed to represent mountains, but, my drawing of mountains are, well, two triangles. So, but you see from his angle, you see how that individual can't see two different mountain ranges. He can't see a huge gap between them. Or what we could do is, Mitchell's trying to show a different picture. on his nifty little iPad there. So I just brought that one up. So if you look on what he's got here, and this is a better drawing I should probably steal and use for the, for the class, for the syllabus. But you see how in that you have a person who's looking at the cross, but looking through the cross to the Antichrist coming, and there's a gap, there's a valley in between. That's the idea here. Even like in this picture that I drew, the little man on the left can't see the gap because he's just seeing the one peak, and it's totally being eclipsed. The gap is being eclipsed. Okay, so that's the idea there. The idea there of the gap would be that we would not we would not we don't always see the gap between the first and second coming of Christ, and you'll see a lot of passages like that.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, I think even in Daniel 9 we see some of that because he's talking about things that happen, and he's even many amillennialists have the same kind of gap issue, because what they do is they see the decree, out comes a decree to rebuild, they rebuild literally, they take the rebuilding, okay, they see this period where Israel's going to be in the land, and then a Messiah is going to come. All that they take literal. And then the last week or last half a week is suddenly figurative. Why? Because they take the ending of this 70-week period to be the end of time. And so if it's the end of time, it's like, well, we got a gap. So the way they solve the gap is to take the last week or half a week
and divide it up between the millennium, or the church age.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that suddenly becomes a figurative. Now, the text allows for a gap, but I don't think it allows for taking the first 69 weeks as literal and the last one as figurative. And so KT is making fun of me saying that I have a gap theory. Yes, it is a gap theory. It's just not the gap theory of Genesis 1 and 2.
It's not the gap theory.
Yeah, it's not the gap theory of creation. I was going to make that joke, and I figured, no, I won't go there. But KT threw me under a bus. Thanks. So you at least see. I mean, I think from the text that the text allows for the gap, but it doesn't allow for a figurative language for the last week.
Mm-hmm.
And so, because of that, I come to this passage and I'll say, well, the easier reading of this, like you said, we take it in its easier reading, its normal sense, and the easier reading is going to be to see the gap there rather than take a figurative. And the reason that and this is the thing and every one of us has to do this, okay? We come to a passage, we are all going to be inclined or tempted to interpret based on our theological system.
Sure, yeah.
Okay? What some people do, and I know because I read one book from an amillennialist that literally what he ended up saying was, well, because of the fact that the end of the 70-week period is the end of time, and that hasn't happened yet, this last 7 week must be figurative. What's he saying? He's saying that his theology is interpreting the text. Okay, so Christina wants to read something. But she's got to unmute herself first. Oh, we're not hearing your microphone. Oh, technology. I'll turn you up. Try now, Christine. No. We can't hear Christine. So we got one or two choices, Christine. Just nod your head. Is it something that you can cut and paste into chat and others of us can read it? If not, you may have to do like Kufi did, was get out and come back in. Oh, you're gonna. Well, just type the passage. Oh, it's from a study Bible. Type what study Bible? I probably have it in Logos.
What study Bible is it?
The fun of technology, folks. You can't see her. The rest of us can see her going. And hear her. You know what she's really saying is, Andrew, I think you're wonderful. You're a great teacher. I love everything you say. That's what I'm hearing. The rest of you aren't hearing that. So if you could type in, KT says I'm hearing voices in my head, or at least I'm hearing voices. Okay, while Christina types that in, I'll give a humor for KT. So I was in the Wretched Studios once, back in the old studios that were where they had a whole control room in the back, and Todd Friel used to have this. He used to have an earpiece where the people in the control room would talk to him, and literally he's like he had turned to a couple of us and he just goes, yeah, and then realized we're looking at him like we didn't say anything. He goes, oh no, sorry guys, I was talking to the voice in my head, and I just turned him like, yeah, we know you got voices in your head, Todd. And the whole room just cracked up laughing. He was like, I'm glad this wasn't live. Okay, so Christine, I think the way we fixed it last time was you got out and got back in. At least that's what worked for. But what study Bible is it? Just type it in real quick. Because if you put it in, I can look it up. Okay, the word for today. The word for today. All right. And that's a study Bible. The word for, so let's see if I have that. No, I don't have that in Logos. It's probably not available in Logos. All right. So, Christine, what I'd say is maybe try going out and come back in, and then we'll see if that fixes it. The other thing you could try to do is play with your settings. Before you get out, just go up to the gear icon and make sure that your microphone is set to a microphone that's working. Maybe try changing the microphone. And just change it and talk, and when we hear you, we'll go, ah, we hear you. Something must have changed because you just got on the screen.
Hello? Hello?
There we go. There we go.
Really?
Yeah, and I see a cat tail.
All right. Oh, you what? That's Gigi's.
A cat walked across the screen. I have some great recipes for cat if you ever need them.
Yeah, I'll remember that. Okay, you ready?
And it wasn't to feed a cat, by the way. Just saying.
I know.
Go for it.
Elf. All right, it says Daniel outlined 70 weeks of years, literally 77s or 490 years that would be coming prophetically, which would include the coming of the Messiah and the future time of tribulation. He predicted that there would be a declaration to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, which was fulfilled by Artaxerxes in 445 BC, and that after this declaration, it would be 69 weeks of years until Messiah would come. This translates to 173,880 days from the declaration to the coming of Messiah. According to the calculations of Sir Robert Anderson and others, accounting for the different calendars, 173,880 days from the declaration of Artaxerxes takes you to April 6th, AD 32, which is the day we believe Jesus was offering himself as the Messiah as he rode into Jerusalem on a donkey. But after 69 weeks were fulfilled, Daniel said that the Messiah would be cut off, but not for himself. This was a crucifixion where he was cut off for us. Daniel went on to treat the 70th week as a separate time when God would judge the earth. The 70th week of Daniel is what we know as the tribulation, and that will be coming in the future. The end.
Yeah, and that so.
It just kind of rolled it all what you were talking about into one paragraph.
Yeah. So you're saying that he could say what takes me many words in just one paragraph.
Yeah.
Was that Chuck Smith or?
Yes, it was.
Okay, that's what I thought. Word for today.
Yeah.
And by the way, you're a Presbyterian reading that.
I know, but I learned from Chuck Smith first.
And for folks who don't know, Presbyterians typically are either amillennial or postmillennial. However, what many people don't realize is when in Niagara Falls, when they had the Niagara Falls conference, discussing what became known as really dispensationalism, it started by discussing premillennialism, and there were many Presbyterians that were in that group. So Presbyterians were involved in believing in you know, premillennialism early on, and even dispensationalism. Now, here's something actually I meant to mention in the beginning. People often go back to the early church fathers to say, well, what was the early church fathers' view? For example, a lot of people make the case that St. Augustine was an amillennialist. Now, here's the dilemma that we have. I actually have a paper I wrote in seminary on this, because when you look at how St. Augustine spoke, Augustine wrote as if he was in a literal 1,000-year period. So he spoke and gave the argument that is known as amillennialism, being that the church age, that now there's this church age, but when you also read his writings, he actually thought it would last 1,000 years, which became a problem in about 1000 AD, when all of a sudden the world didn't end.
Well, even with Augustine,
for some Christians in 2000 AD too, by the way. Y2K problem, but
yeah.
you know, so it is a difficult thing when you go to the early church fathers, and here's the reason why. Keep in mind that our theology is progressive. Meaning that much of our theology develops over time, and often it develops because we're responding to error. Okay? You look at Augustine, and he did a phenomenal job in explaining the doctrine of salvation. Why? Because he had to, because of a man named Pelagian. Okay?
Pelagius, yeah.
He's making this case, and Augustine is responding to him, and he's developing the theology. You know, we have the same thing with Luther responding to the Catholic Church and giving a clearer explanation of the doctrine of that we get the Scripture alone, right? He made that case, although he didn't coin it, but he made the case for it. We have him defining justification by faith alone. You see a lot of that being developed over time, and often from responding to error. So just keep that in mind when you go to. I mean, people try to say that the early church fathers believed in amillennialism, premillennialism, postmillennialism. Everyone finds the early church fathers that believed in their point. And so you just got to keep that in mind. The early church fathers don't have the shoulders that we stand on. They were the shoulders. We stand on the shoulders of giants. We stand on people who came before us working through the system. But remember, these guys were working it through on their own. I mean, think about, you know, Athanasius. As Athanasius is wrestling with trying to define the Trinity. There was no definition of the Trinity before that. I mean, they were wrestling with it, and then he ended up coming up with a certain phrasing and certain explanation that was like, that's it. That explains it. So we got to keep that in mind. So Joe, you want to chime in?
Yeah, just you know, just a couple things. You know, for one, you know, like you said, it is progressive. As time goes on, we learn more. We have to deal with heresies and all that. But I mean, just when the Messiah came, when Jesus came, you know, I mean, imagine the confusion. Well, he was gonna be born in Bethlehem. He was gonna come out of Egypt. He was gonna be called a Nazarene. You know, and people are, you know, they couldn't figure out who the Messiah was. I mean, you know, John the Baptist. Well, why did he know? Oh, because he was a prophet from God. And then this, you know, everybody else believed what was told them. So it wasn't like anyone said, "Hey, ooh, that's the Messiah." I know because I've read Scripture. So I think it's something that developed, and then
What about
also,
Simeon?
go ahead. Go ahead. Christine, did you say something?
Yeah, what about Simeon?
What did Simeon? Tell me about
Well, you
Simeon.
have you have Simeon, you have Anna that had a clear understanding. You had the
Oh, the
Magi who clearly
yeah.
understood, and I would argue the Magi, I believe, came from Babylonian area and knew the prophecy of Daniel 9. They knew when the Messiah was coming, and that's why they showed up. That's why they
Because
were
of
looking for
Daniel.
a star. I would argue.
Because Daniel was put over the Magi, wasn't he?
Yeah. And so, but you do have people that clearly did understand, um, but it wasn't always as well thought out. I mean, for example, Joe mentioned that they would look for the Messiah coming out of Egypt. I would say no, they didn't. If you look at that passage in Matthew, out of Egypt I will call my son, and go back into the Old Testament to where that is referenced,
Hosea.
it's speaking of Israel, the
Israel.
nation, not
Mhm.
the Messiah. So I don't think anyone would have seen, and this is the thing, I don't think anyone would have seen that is talking about Christ until God said it was talking about Christ.
Right.
Okay, so I want to open it up. Before we open it up to other questions on other topics, anyone else want to chime in on this one? I know we got Kofi. You've been kind of chatting some, um, and I know that we have Jason here, and I do want to get Jason to unmute in a bit, because I've been listening to his podcast recently and really enjoying it. So I'm going to want him to talk about that in a moment. So Kofi, do you have anything you want to add in, or anyone else?
Well, I think it's interesting that you raised the point about our systematic theology sort of being the sort of front end to our exegesis of the text. And I think um, for me, as somebody who has actually been on both sides of the eschatological fence, well, two sides, I guess, having both been R-mill and pre-mill, um, there is definitely a sense in which I think on both sides this happens, where we kind of allow the system to determine how we interpret individual passages, rather than allowing individual passages to inform the way that we arrive at our system. And for me, hearing both of you go back and forth, I think there's a clear willingness on both sides, which you don't see in a lot of discussions on this issue, to allow both our systems to inform how we view the text, but also to allow individual passages to have their say, such that, for example, we got to Revelation 20, he said, could be metaphorical. Okay. Jay was willing to say, yeah, there could be a literal chain that does apply to immaterial beings like angels. It's allowing the text to speak on its own merit rather than saying it can't possibly mean this because here's what my system says, and my system says it can't mean this.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, this is one of the things when I talk about in the our class on hermeneutics, on how to interpret the Bible, or I teach. One of the things I constantly am saying when I teach we have a seminar called the Bible Interpretation Made Easy seminar. We go into churches for a weekend and I teach how to interpret the Bible. It's one of the big problems. There's two things. There's two ways to interpret the Bible, either by experience or by rule. And it really comes down to those two. And the majority of us, and I'm saying myself because I'm sure I'm guilty of it. I don't know where, but I'm sure that I'm guilty of it. Is that what we do? Is we either are going to interpret by our experience. So in other words, this is what I've experienced. So that validates this passage of scripture, and that's what I think the meaning is. Or it's my experience from my theological system. I read into the text my system. We always have to be mindful of that. That's one of the first rules that in hermeneutics that I remember learning in seminary was challenge your own presuppositions from your theological system. Know how your system interprets the passage, and know where you need to question that, because that's one of the things that we could be guilty of. And it's a big problem that many of us have, because most of us are unaware that we're doing it. You know, if we don't look for it, it's one of the reasons why I'm always trying to challenge myself to go, well, am I doing that? Am I reading into a passage because my system says that? And no, Christine, I'm not a 4-pointer.
Right?
Yep.
I just don't use the points altogether. The labels just aren't as clear as they should be. All right. So anyone else have questions on that? I know I do want to get Jason to pipe up a little, and I see that Dustin came in. So I don't know if I get nervous when Dustin pops in. You know, what kind of questions he's going to ask. But so you got any questions you guys have or comments? All right. If not, Jason, I want you to unmute real quick since you're here, and just give let folks know about your podcast that you got.
All right, can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can.
Not getting feedback this time?
No, it's sounding good.
Okay, very good. My podcast is Logical Belief Ministries. You can visit my website, logicalbelief.org. I've been doing that for about, I think I have 21 episodes out there now. I mostly cover, apologetics and theology. When it comes to eschatology, I'm going to have to engage in the Dillahunty Dodge.
Okay, now you got to explain the Dillahunty Dodge for those who don't watch Matt Slick and Dillahunty, which they should be watching us on Sunday nights. But
so what I'm going to do here is I'll probably ask you a few questions. I just won't take any position myself, so I can't be cross-examined. So
that's the definition of Dillahunty Dodge. Is Matt Dillahunty in his debates was ignoring his own positions, not taking a position, so that he can't be cross-examined.
I have a position on eschatology. Not one that I would say I'm strongly holding to. I'm kind of developing some of that. I come from a background that's strongly dispensational, classical dispensational, which I would not hold to today, but that is historically my background. So, I always have questions I like to ask dispensationalists or even premillennialists. I would probably lean more historic premill at this point and probably lean more towards New Covenant theology if you would pin me into a corner on it. But I would be curious, Andrew, on exactly what your position is in Matthew 24, and maybe this come out because I had to step out a few times to take care of my son, get him ready for bed. But what is your position in Matthew 24 in the Olivet Discourse, where Jesus says that this generation will not pass away until all these things take place in verse 34 of chapter 24?
Yeah, that's which verse again?
Matthew 24, verse 34.
34. So yeah, my position on this has been I think when he's going through this, and in verse 29 he says immediately after these tribulations and days, he's explaining all these things that are going to be seen. And then in verse 34 he says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until these things come to pass." I think that this generation is not this generation that Christ is physically speaking to, but this generation that is seeing all the events that he's describing.
Wouldn't he have said that generation then? Or is that just being nitpicky?
Well, I think one of the things. So one thing we always have to be aware of, right, is that we don't want to try to reinterpret the way they should have spoken for the way we speak, because this wasn't written in English anyway. Sorry for those who think that King James is the first Bible. I know most of us realize it wasn't, but you all actually run into professing atheists that argue that, but it's kind of funny when they do.
Yeah, they go after the unicorn passages and all of that.
No, I've actually run into on the streets to guys that argue that the King James Bible, the 1611 King James Bible, was the first Bible ever.
Yeah.
And it's like, in 1611.
Hmm.
Okay, so
So
that
I would follow that up with a question then. In Matthew 23, verse 36, Jesus just prior, he uses the same verbiage when speaking to the Pharisees. Says, "Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation." He uses the term again.
yeah.
So you would hold that in Matthew 24, verse 35, it's speaking of the future generation, but in just the previous chapter, it's referring to the generation that he was speaking to.
Yeah, I would, and I don't. Now the thing is I don't think there's anything in the text that, I don't think that there's anything from the text that says this it cannot be a legitimate way for him to be speaking, because he's describing the things that they're going to be seeing, and then says this generation. I'm gonna just mute Christine. Sorry, Christine. We're just getting feedback from you.
Honestly, I have to say this text is the one that I struggle with the most.
Yeah.
When it comes to my historic pre-mill view, which I would lean towards at this point. But I struggle with this particular text because from the partial preterist amillennial view, I attend a Reformed Baptist church, and my pastor would hold that everything prior to when Jesus says this generation, everything prior to when Jesus said that, was completed in AD 70. Now, I see other difficulties with that, but this is a text that I'm actually struggling with, because if I'm going to be consistent within the, even when Jesus uses the term earlier in the previous chapter, I want to be consistent in my exegesis of Scripture, and so I'm struggling with this text from my more historic pre-mill view.
Yeah. So here's a first rule that and this is actually before you jumped in, we were talking about 1,000 years, and I mentioned this, but here's the thing, and this is something that I see a lot of people do, and there's no reason to do it, and that's this: because we see a phrase or a word used in one way at one time in one passage, doesn't mean it always means the same thing in every passage everywhere. And so, because Jason, I know you come to the Bible Thumping Wingnut Hangouts on Sunday nights, and some of us others, Vincent's in here, and we've dealt with a guy. I know Vincent has a Seventh-day Adventist who we've done on this channel. We've done some hangouts with, discussing whether you can lose your salvation, and he would be guilty of doing this all the time. He takes a word that he sees in one passage, meaning one thing, and then everywhere else that he sees the word. So, for example, the word belief. He sees that in one passage referring to regeneration, so he ends up saying in every other passage it refers to regeneration. And so I turn to a passage in James and say, the demons believe. And suddenly he was like, well, then demons believe. Why? Because he was reading into it a meaning that isn't. Believe doesn't only mean regeneration, but he was reading that in. So what we have to do is take the phrase this generation in its immediate context first. If it's not clear in the immediate context, then we go to other contexts. But the other context may give a incorrect view of the context you're in, because it could have two different references. So in this example, this generation could mean a different group of people than the previous one. So Dustin says he's got to run, but did you want to add anything, Dustin? Or you jumped in? Any comments you want to add before you go? He's also speaking in Spanish, which doesn't help me any. I don't know Spanish.
So I'm I'm actually curious here. If you've listened to a few of my podcast episodes, which ones have you listened to?
I listened about. I'll give you the numbers. I know it was the last 4 or 5.
Oh, okay.
Let me
Where I
see.
went into the transcendental argument. I had one on
Yeah,
the
I
gospel.
really appreciated when you did that. I think you handled, for a lot of people that is a difficult topic to understand, and I thought you handled that well. I started listening at episode 18, which was the tag argument, transcendental argument for God. Your one on the gospel, postmodernism in the church was killer. Um, that was I think a lot of people need to listen to that podcast. And then the how unbelievers borrow from Christianity. So those were the 4. I haven't gone back. I've been meaning to go back to some of the earlier podcasts, but
Well, be careful. You might come out a 5-pointer. So.
well, no. See, this is where people don't understand it. My beliefs are not based on the labels of 5-pointer or on the labels.
I'm just
And this
giving
is
you a
why,
hard time.
because the labels have been so maligned by people, and there's people who hate Calvinism, yet they can't properly define it.
Well, I mean, one thing
Now,
when
that's not the
somebody
label's
asks me
fault.
if I'm a Calvinist, I typically say, well, what do you think a Calvinist is?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I have to always ask that question first because there is such major caricaturation out there, misrepresenting really what it is, and so a lot of times, well, it depends really on what you think it is.
Well,
This
here's
is the
the
way I
here's the
deal with
story I tell. A very very well known evangelist who hates Calvinism. I mean, when I say he hates it, he's writing books against it. Calls it a false gospel. Calls it
Cahill.
heresy. Basically says if you believe in Calvinism, you're not saved. I mean, he won't return my phone calls. For years I haven't. He won't return phone calls. He won't return emails because he says I'm not saved. And the reality is I actually sat there on a phone conversation with him and walked through all of the 5 points of Calvinism. I think you were holding up his book there.
Yeah, I think you're probably talking about Mark Cahill.
Yeah. I walked him through all 5 points of Calvinism without using the labels, but giving the definition, and he agreed to every one of them. And that's the irony. He actually believes in the system. It's just he has a wrong understanding of the label. And this is where labels are only helpful if you have the same definition for the label. If you don't have the same definition for the label, they're not helpful. They cause problems. It's one of the things, Len Pettis from Bible Thumping Wingnut is going to be doing a debate with Chris Date at NorCal Fire in September. And one of the things I talked to Len about is, actually to both of them, I said, we need clear definitions. What I actually want to do is get both of them to have a list of words so that when we say, whatever the word, we say hell, this is what Len means by hell. This is what Chris means by hell. So that, people in the audience would have a sheet during the debate to understand how each of these two individuals may take the same word and have a different understanding of its meaning. And because I'm suggesting that to them because it's going to take away some of the talking past one another that often happens, especially in a debate, and people not clearly understanding what's being said because they think they're having a different thinking of it. And that happens with Calvinism a lot.
Yeah, from my experience, though, even when it comes to Calvinism, though, even once you very clearly explain the doctrines of grace to somebody, even if you're not using the labels, if they're opposed to God's sovereign choice in salvation, it doesn't really matter how you explain it. They're going to be opposed to it. I mean, that's been my experience. I'm going from a Calvary chapel. I used to attend a Calvary chapel for almost 4 years, and I went from there to a Reformed Baptist church. And I had, quite a few people get pretty upset at me from the previous church that we went to. They were not very happy that we had changed churches for, to me, I think the doctrines of grace are important enough that if I have a church that teaches that, that's where I'm going to go. And so they weren't, there's, even though I was gracious, I thought, I didn't really, I didn't put anybody down or anything like that, but there was some animus towards, we had some anti-Calvinists come out of the woodwork that weren't very happy with my wife and I for leaving the church and going to a Reformed church.
Yeah, and that's the reason I stay away from labels unless I know that we all have an agreement on what the labels mean. Even dispensationalism, it becomes a problem because if I say I'm a dispensationalist, some people think I'm just talking end times, and I'm not talking end times at all. I'm talking on how you interpret the Bible.
We're talking all 7 dispensations and that whole deal too.
Yeah, people will get into all that. When I talk dispensationalism, I'm talking about how you interpret the Bible.
Well, let me ask you this position on classical dispensationalism, which I don't think you are. I think you're a progressive.
No, I wouldn't be.
Yeah. Now, do you have, now correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't classical dispensationalism, isn't it the Darby-Scofield dispensationalism, doesn't it teach that there was salvation was by works in the Old Covenant accomplished in such a way? Because if that is true, that's a heresy. I'm sorry.
Okay. Darby in the original Darby Study Bible did state a covenant of works of salvation in the Old Testament. It was quickly corrected in the second edition in what was in the newer the second edition of it, and people go back to that. But this is a classic thing. I use this as a classic example of the problems when studying theology and talking past each other. In the seminary I went to, one of the things they drilled into us was to always read the other side. Okay? If I had to write a paper, we would often have to write papers. I had to write papers from positions I didn't hold. Okay, and the reason was to get us to be to a point where we, the dean of the seminary basically had told me once, he says, you don't really understand a position unless you can argue that position. When you can argue that position better than the people that hold that position, then you have the right to start knocking it. But until you understand it well enough that someone that holds the position can says, hey, you're arguing my position perfectly, right? That was the point he would always try to make. And so I was sitting in a class on dispensationalism, and I'm reading, I'm paraphrasing, and I really wish that I put like bookmarks in the 2 books that I had, because I really should go back and do this one day and figure out the books. But in my seminary, I had to read about 1,500 pages of outside reading per class, so it's kind of hard to find which ones they were. But basically, I was reading a dispensational book, and basically this is what it said, that covenant theologians believe in 2 ways of salvation. Works in the Old Testament under a covenant of works, and grace in the New Testament. But we dispensationalists believe that ever since the fall, it has been by grace. And I said, well, I believe ever since the fall it's been by grace. I don't believe we've ever been saved by works in Old or New Testament. So, okay, I must be dispensational. But then, after I read all the dispensational books, I start reading books written by covenant theologians, and I read, someone writing that dispensationalists believe in 2 ways of salvation. Works in the Old, grace in the New. And what do they quote? Darby's original notes to prove that there was this idea of work. And what was the dispensationalist doing? He was taking this idea of a covenant of works and saying that means you're saved by works. That's an error in the way he's handling it. It's just that's a description used for the covenant, not a description of how you get saved. But what is the covenant theologian doing? He's attacking a whole system based on what Darby said in notes that were corrected afterwards in like the second edition, third edition. Or was it wasn't Darby, it was and I think it was Schofield in Schofield's notes. think it was in the Schofield's notes, and then the new Schofield notes was edited. But basically, what you end up having is you had a case where both of them, because the covenant theologian went on to say that basically in covenant theology they've only believed in after the fall that it's salvation by grace. And I'm going, wait a minute. I remember pulling the other book off the shelf. I literally looked at them, and I was like, these guys are saying the exact same thing, and they're making the same attack against each other, and they don't even know it. Like, they don't even realize it. So,
well, I mean, I grew up in a church though that was classical dispensational, and while there are dispensationalists that don't hold to that. I mean, I was taught that, and I grew up in I don't know if you're familiar with conservative Mennonites, but that's the environment that I grew up in, and many of them are actually believe and teach. I remember it even being taught over the pulpit that in the Old Testament you had to keep the law in order to be saved, and some of them even go, you Anabaptist scum, okay? Yeah, I'm definitely not Anabaptist anymore.
How many people even got that joke? I mean, clearly you picked up on it because, as I know from the figures on the wall behind you, you study history. But that's a history joke.
Yeah. Well, that's things that Calvin and Luther said. But
sorry, I just had to say it.
But I think I lost my train of thought there. But okay. So yeah, we were taught classical dispensationalism, and some of them went as far as to say that during the tribulation period, if you missed the boat, if you missed the rapture, you were going to be back in a situation where you're going to have faith plus works in order to be saved. And I would even say that a lot of Anabaptist theology, because it's very strongly Arminian, a lot of them would even deny sola fide. It would actually deny faith alone. And so even during this dispensation, they would say that, well, you have to have works in order to be saved. It's a requirement for salvation.
You're going to see that with those guys because some of those folks also say you can lose your salvation and gain it again.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, they're vitriolic. If you think that you can't lose your salvation, they will. That's the thing that my parents are still conservative Mennonite, and my dad is very upset at me because of my belief that I'm actually secure in Christ. He told me I was taught better. This a little while ago.
By the Holy Spirit and His Word.
Yes, absolutely. But
that may not be the thing you want to say to Dad, but
yeah. but I have seen that classical dispensationalism, that flavor of it's actively taught and believed and held to, despite
I don't know if that's so much
it is misrepresented for some. I agree with that. But.
Let me ask you this, because you're more in touch with it. Do you think it's more because of their dispensationalism, or do you think it's more because of their legalism? In other words, because whenever you have a group that believes that you can lose your salvation or you get salvation by grace, but you maintain it by works, any of those groups end up getting into legalism and really becomes
absolutely.
So do you think it's more on that teaching that they have that, or from the dispensationalism?
Yeah, I would say it's probably a combination of both. But yeah, there's no doubt about that. Anybody who denies that you're actually saved, that Christ actually saves, and that instead, He simply makes salvation possible, and you maintain it by your own actions and works. Yeah, by necessity, you're going to have just a very skewed, you're going to see the covenant of works in the Old Testament, which a covenant theologian would say, yes, there was a covenant of works, but nobody was able to accomplish it. They would actually then say, well, yeah, people were able to accomplish it, because they're basically Pelagians. Almost, in some cases, I would say a lot of conservative Mennonites and even the Amish are very close to being full-blown Pelagians. You would probably classify them as semi-Pelagian, but many of them believe that you actually fully have the ability to please God and to merit salvation on your own.
Well, see, now, and here's the thing. I would actually say, and I often say this sometimes open air, and I had one guy that has really ripped into me. Calls me a false prophet for saying it, but if you think it through, there's two ways to get to heaven.
Yeah, there
One is
is.
by works.
Absolutely. Nobody
The
can do
other
it
is
except
by
Christ.
grace. The problem with the one by works is you have to keep the law 100%, and none of us can do it. That's the reason we need the grace. And so it was, we're not saved by works. I didn't say we're saved by works. I said you can get it. I said it would be unjust for God to judge a perfect person as if he's a sinner.
Well, let me throw this one at you. We actually are saved by works.
That's right, the works of Christ.
The works of Christ, yeah.
That's why I say there's only two religions in the world. There's a religion of human effort and religion of divine effort, and there's only those two. And when you simplify it that way, you can take every world religion other than Christianity, and it falls within the religion of human effort in one way or another, because
Absolutely.
they add works. It's either completely by works or faith plus works, but works become the ultimate thing. And the only one that says it's by grace alone is Christianity. And so if we're going to look at these two, people go, well, how do you know which religion's right? Well, it's real simple. Which religion is the only religion that says God does all the work? Christianity. Every other religion says the human does the work. That's man-made. So man makes religions where they become God, where they do the ultimate thing to get right with God, and God says the right religion is where he does the work. Real easy to figure out now.
Well, I got one final question for my dispensationalist friend, Andrew Rappaport.
Okay. we got a question in the chat for you, so.
Okay, well, let's do this one real quick. You just tell me how you would respond to this. This is just Romans 9, verse 6. Since you see a clear distinction between Israel and the church, how do you handle Romans 9:6?
Okay, so Romans 9:6 says, but it is not as though the word of God has failed, but for all who descended from Israel belong to Israel, going on in verse 7, but not all the children of Abraham, because of his offspring, through Isaac, were named offspring. So I guess the question you're having here is the issue of that not all of the descended from Israel belong to Israel, right?
Yeah, how do you as a dispensationalist,
Yeah.
if, how do you, since you see a clear distinction here, and it would say that not all who are descended from Israel, Jacob, belong to Israel, and then I would also throw in Galatians 3:7 in on that also, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
And the way I would take this, and I did mention this one earlier, is the fact that, and I don't think it's as clear of a distinction as people like to make it. I mean, I think the classical dispensationalists, it's a hard line. There's no similarity. There are some ways that God works with his people, both Israel and the church, that's similar. Now, in this case, I think the way I handle this passage is, I think, easy. I think it's actually easier as a dispensationalist, but because he's talking about the Israelites, those literally descendants of Israel, those that are known as national Israel. All right. Verse 4, they are Israel, to them who belong to the adoption. You have this idea of a distinction between the national Israel and those that are saved. So we often call that spiritual Israel. That's the terminology you'll hear a lot of people refer to it as. So I would have no problem with this, because what this is showing that not everybody who is born, the line of Abraham, line of Isaac, line of Jacob, not all of them, just because they're born of that lineage, are going to heaven. Why is that important? Well, speaking as someone who's Jewish, that's how I was raised. I mean, I remember the guy that led me to Christ. He shared the gospel with me, and I remember my comment to him was, Chuck, that's great for you, but I'm God's chosen people. I'm in like Flynn. I thought my Judaism, being born of Abraham, was going to save me because that's what I was taught to believe. Okay? And so there is a notion where people are thinking that because they're of Abraham's line, specifically through Isaac, specifically through Jacob, they are guaranteed to be in a right state with God. They're God's chosen people. I think what he's doing here is making the distinction. Just because they're born of that line, that's not how they got saved. They weren't saved by their lineage. That lineage served as God's special people for a special purpose, to bring about the Messiah, to bring forth God's word. They failed in bringing the word of God to all the nations like they were supposed to. But the argument I would say is that they're not all Israel, meaning they're not all saved. Is this spiritual Israel?
Well, how
So
about
would you hold that spiritual Israel and the church are synonymous? Are the same thing?
No, this is where I guess I see a little bit of the distinction. I think what he's speaking of here is those that are national Israel, those who are born of a descendant of Jacob, versus those that actually believe, but still Israel, still Old Testament Israel. But he is making a connection, clearly, to the church. And so there is that.
what about Romans 11:7? Where what are we grafted into then? Some branches are taken off, and the Gentiles are grafted in. What are we grafted into?
Yeah, I think that what it see where I think that you ended up having the church being this. I think there is this transitionary time where the church started out really Jewish, if you early books of Acts.
Yeah, it went to the Jews first.
Yeah, but it changed. I mean, it's kind of funny because people often will sit there and say, well, there's not a lot of Jewish people that are Christian. Well, yeah, because what happens this next generation? What do we call them? We don't call them Jewish. We call them Christian. I mean, my children don't call themselves Jewish. They call themselves Christian, right? The first generation of Christians in the first century church, though they may most have been Jewish, within a generation, they lost that distinction and were just called themselves Christian, and they identified themselves different. But there's probably a lot of people that go by the name Christian that still have lineage back to, Abraham and don't know it.
Now, I would do a follow-up question with that Galatians 3:7 then, knowing that it is those of faith who are the sons of Abraham. Do you think that Paul is making the same argument in Galatians 3:7 as he is in Romans 9:6? So that those of us that are of faith, that we are the sons of Abraham. Is this all-encompassing of all believers, whereas in Romans 9:6 it's more of believing Jews?
Yeah, I do think that this is going to be, and this is where he's saying that in this sense of, I mean, clearly just because you believe in Christ doesn't suddenly change your lineage. But in a spiritual sense, he's, and because God's saying it, therefore that settles it. He's saying that there is this sense where we're in a in a special relationship, the way, because of belief, and he is saying that it's tied, to having faith just as Abraham. Now, is this a sense? Now, where I guess where I make the distinction is when we start to look and say, and start to count the church as if everything that is true of Israel is true for the church because of these verses. When these verses are speaking, really, when you look at them, when they make that distinction, they talk about salvation, regeneration specifically, right? It's a regeneration issue that's putting you in this relationship.
Where I struggle with melding the two together is because I see there specific promises given to the children of Abraham in the Old Testament, things like land promises and things like that, and I struggle with the full covenant theology view that all this was fulfilled in Christ in the church, that the church inherits all these promises. And I see that this is your land forever. So, like I said, my eschatological view is something that's in something that I'm developing.
Yeah.
I so when I'm asking these questions, it's because I want to see. I want to begin to understand this in more fully because I see problems on both sides. I'm not seeing a clear solution both ways. I see things where the church is spiritual Israel. To me, Romans 9:6 here seems like, those, not all that are descended from Israel, in the flesh actually belong to Israel, and those who are of faith are the children of Abraham. But there is still some distinctions which I just don't see some of the promises in the Old Testament actually fulfilled in the church unless somebody can show me how they are.
Well, and this is where I
That's
struggle when, especially with like theonomy, which tries to really take a hard line that Israel and the church are one. Because how do you then you should obey, and this is the issue I have. If you're really believing that Israel and the church are one, then you should follow through with all of the Old Testament law. And people will make a distinction between ceremonial law, moral law, and civil law. But you show me in the scriptures where that distinction is made. That distinction is made in the Westminster Catechism, or sorry, Westminster Confession. That's not made in the scripture. That every civil law is a moral law. Every ceremonial law is a moral law.
Well, I would agree to that to a point, but
well, here's where I get to the thing though. What a lot of people try to do is say, well, the ceremonial law is done with, but then you should still keep the laws that were specifically designed for separation, like keeping kosher, because that's not ceremonial. That was to keep them separate from the world, keep them separate from their neighbors. Well, and so if that was the specific reason for that law, well, we should be separate from the world today, even as believers.
I would have a question then in Romans 2:15. It says, they show that the work of the law is written on their hearts. So I'm seeing Paul making a distinction here because he's not saying that the ceremonial law is written on their hearts. What part of the law is he saying that's written on their heart? This is where I think that Paul does make somewhat of a distinction between moral, ceremonial, and civil, because he's not saying the civil and the ceremonial law. He's not saying that it's written upon their law not to wear, or upon their heart not to wear mixed threads, or to eat shellfish. But he is saying that the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, the moral law is written upon their hearts, and so.
Let me give a different way of classifying these that has no problem with the passage you bring up in Romans, and that is universal laws for all humans, all times, everywhere, and laws that are specific to groups of people, such as specific laws to the nation of Israel, which are going to be different than laws for the church. And there are some things that are universal, like most of the Decalogue. And I say most of the Decalogue only because we don't, and this is where any New Covenant theologian will, be happy. But I don't see the Sabbath being repeated in the New Covenant, so I wouldn't, I don't know that, the people always go with the Ten Commandments. 9 of them were repeated in the New Testament, so at least 9 of them, we continue. But having the specific Sabbath, I think that we actually go back to the Sabbath that was before the nation of Israel, which was a little bit had some different, it was a day set aside for God versus a day of not working, things like that. So, I think that changed.
Alrighty. Well, did you say that somebody had a question for me? I'm going to have to leave here a little bit. My wife.
So there is someone in the chat. Larry is saying that he would like to know where he can get a hold of that 5 solas plaque behind you.
Oh. Well, all you do is you find the picture on YouTube, and you save the picture to a thumb drive, and you go to your local photo printing shop and print it off.
In other words, you have that picture already saved somewhere?
Yeah, I can send it. I can email it to anybody who wants it. Yeah.
Okay,
if you email me, if you go to my website, just drop me an email. I can respond to you with the picture. Yeah, no problem.
So go to logicalbelief.org, say, hey, I want that picture, and then you can ask him who the pictures are over his head. We did mention one of them earlier today, right? One of those characters behind you is Athanasius, if I'm correct?
Yeah. Yeah, the first one is Athanasius right here, and then we got St. Augustine, Augustine of Hippo, and then we got Spurgeon, and then Calvin. They're back there to remind me to stay orthodox when I'm on, on my podcast.
So we're talking about developing theology. Actually, we mentioned two of them and referenced the third there. Joe Conkle saying he thought that was Arius. And there you go. I mean, Arius was the reason that we know of the definition of the Trinity and Athanasius. I mean, you always see this in theology. You always see this. You see two positions, two people typically that are going side to side, in addressing the theological issues, and the orthodox position comes out typically from somebody who is saying something that's unorthodox, and people kind of go, it's unorthodox, but we don't know how yet. And so it's like examining the scripture, seeing what someone's saying, looking at the scripture and going, no, that doesn't fit, and then the system gets developed through that.
Yeah, heresy always precedes orthodoxy. Yeah.
Didn't Santa Claus punch him or something?
Yeah.
Did it Santa Claus what?
Yeah, Saint Nick punched Arius in the Council
He
of
punched
Nicaea.
him.
At least that's the story. I don't know if that's true or not.
See, Larry's upset. He said it looks like it's an etched mirror, and now he's disappointed. So if there's anyone out there that knows how to do some etched mirroring and do the five solas, I think it's just a nice glossy glass there.
Yeah, that's all it is. It's just gloss picture with glass over the front of it.
Well, hey, Jason, thanks for coming in, asking some questions. I mean, we could talk more offline if you ever want to talk more on that, on some of the dispensational stuff. I do have some classes in our system, in the systematic theology, specifically under bibliology, and then there's some at the tail end of the classes on hermeneutics that I kind of cover a little bit of that. But the real issue is, when it comes to dispensationalism, is it's a hermeneutical system. It's not an end-time system, and so that's usually the problem most people make. So,
alrighty, well, thanks for having me on.
All right. When you do, I haven't gotten any podcasts recently. Have you been taking some time off?
I only skipped. I had to skip one weekend. I was on a business trip, and I didn't do one Saturday. We had family here for Christmas, and so I'm probably going to pop one out tomorrow morning. I have a topic I want to discuss. I want to discuss something that's been going around on the internet, and because it came up on my own Facebook wall and I had to address it, I thought it'd be a good topic to discuss. But is this discussion that's been going on, and whether, do the Muslims worship the same God, and do we worship the same God as the Jews? And I thought it was a really good question. I had posted on my Facebook wall, and somebody actually came up, well, do you as a Christian, and this guy wasn't a Christian, but do you as a Christian worship the same God as the Jews? And I had another friend of mine who was a Christian who popped right in and said, absolutely. And I had to jump in and kind of correct that. And I think there's a lot of Christians that would make that mistake just initially. The knee-jerk reaction, well, yeah, we worship the same God. Well, I would say that Jews today do not worship the same God that we worship.
Yeah.
Believing Jews of the Old Testament worship the same God that we do.
It's a definitive yes and no.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, believing Jews in the Old Testament that truly believed in Yahweh would have also then believed in Jesus Christ, because they were regenerated. And they would have been led by the Holy Spirit to all truth. So a believing Jew in the Old Testament did worship the same Yahweh that we worship as Christians. But Jews that have rejected Yahweh's revelation of himself since the time of Christ are not worshiping the same God that we as Christians worship, because God has revealed himself further, and they've rejected his further revelation of himself. So I would say that, yeah, Jews today
I like what
don't
what
worship.
Dustin says in the chat. He says short answer, yes and yes, in one way. Long answer and better answer, no and no. But mostly no in every sense.
Yeah. He who has not the Father, or who does not have the Son, does not have the Father. That's what 1 John chapter 3, and then you also have John 8:24, where Jesus said, "Unless you believe I am He, you will die in your sins." So if somebody doesn't acknowledge that Jesus Christ is the I am, He's the ego I me, and somebody doesn't acknowledge the Son, then he does not have the Father, and therefore they do not have God.
Well, one of the things that a lot of people don't understand about Judaism is that after Christ, Judaism, I mean, there was a difference of Judaism from Old Testament Judaism before Christ. But after Christ, the writings in the Talmud were mostly responding to Christianity. A lot of it's responding to Christianity and clarifying in their mind their theology against what was being taught by Christians. And so, it is this sense where they were teaching a legalistic system, but after Christ, they were going to reject anything that could have a hint of Trinity to it. So now they're solidifying a totally different view of God. So it's not the same God after Christ for sure, because they solidified it to say, no, when we say one God, we mean one person.
Well, Andrew, you would probably know this better than anybody else in here, but didn't the Jewish commentators before the time of the New Testament, wasn't there discussions among the Jewish rabbis and commentators that there was seemingly a plurality in the Godhead that they saw through Scripture in many places, and they
this is where it gets interesting. I don't see that in the Talmud when I read through the Talmud, but there's a lot of other writings where some of that you do see it. I remember, and I kick myself because when I went through several years of Hebrew school, 12, 13 years of Hebrew school, and I just couldn't wait to get out of there, kind of. And now I kick myself because there were things I was taught that I was like, oh, I wish I could I wish I got the reference for that. But I remember being taught about, in Hebrew school about this plurality of God, but I didn't remember the details of it, and it wasn't something that really stuck with me to care at that age. It wasn't until, I had stopped going to Hebrew school for about 2 years, then became a Christian, and you gotta understand, as a Christian, I didn't understand anything of the Trinity for another 6 years before I ever heard that term Trinity and learned about the Trinity. I knew Jesus was God, but I didn't understand the Trinity and things like that. I didn't, So by that point, it was 8 years removed, or 8 years plus removed from Hebrew school, and I just, then when I was like, oh, what was it I learned? What was it? It was too far gone in my memory. Too many years of not being a Christian in my way of life and doing stupid things that affect memory that plague me. But yeah, there are some writings though that when I was going through studying Judaism, for my book, What Do They Believe, there was some stuff that I saw, but I didn't see it so much in the Talmud. Okay, why did Dustin mute me? Are you guys hearing me okay?
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay. Dustin's just playing? He doesn't have... He's got controls to mute me? Wow.
You were just softer. I could still hear a little.
So anyway, so the point being is, when we look at Jewish writing, even in the Talmud, when we do see some ideas of a plurality, often the way I end up seeing it is it's not really clear, and sometimes it was referencing, the one time that I can remember, it was talking about the angelic host, and that was in reference to the plural pronouns that you see in Genesis, where it says, "Let us make man in our image." In the Talmud they reference that to be the host. is how it was referenced. So it's just, I think that's including angels, but they see the plurality. It's just not really clear sometimes. They're not thinking of it as a plurality, I think, in Godhead, at least not anymore for sure. And one of the things with the Talmud that people don't understand is that it was a redacted work. It was something that people came and edited. That's how it was developed. So, you know, I come along and I write 5 pages on a topic. Jason, you come along, you take my 5 pages, you edit those down to, you know, 3 pages. You write 2 pages on your own. You know, Dustin comes along and he thinks that the two of us were really verbose, so he just takes both of ours, puts it down into 1 paragraph, and he writes about 10 pages on his own. You know, Vincent comes along and realizes that, you know, Dustin didn't know what he was talking about, so he takes our 2 paragraphs and turns those into 1 sentence or 2, takes, you know, Dustin and makes that into 1 page, and then he writes 3 more of his own. That's how they would do that work. And so it becomes a thing where you kind of almost have to go back and look at older copies of the Talmud, which we don't have a lot of, to be able to get some of that history and what was said back then. That was one of the things that helped with the Dead Sea Scrolls, is you know, some of those older documents came back into play. So I don't know if that helps you any.
No, that's good. Alrighty, well, I'm gonna have to bow out here, so thanks.
All right.
Andrew, I think KT had a question.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Well, it was about the millennium, because I believe the 1,000 years, but I was thinking like in Egypt, you know, where the Israelites were. I think it said 400 years, and it was really, was it 430? So could it be rounding?
Yeah. So in that case, you had a specific time period, and an author says about 400, and you can have that. The reason in Revelation 20 I don't think that's the case is because he uses it 6 times in 6 verses. I think he's being really specific. It's kind of the same argument that many people would make, you know, since you decided to throw me under the bus with the gap theory joke. I'll bring creationism into it, right? When people make the case that the word yom, when it elsewhere, everywhere else outside of Genesis 1 and 2, where yom is referenced with a number or day and evening, it always means a literal 24-hour day. So people will say, right, one, it's, you know, evening, morning, first day, evening, morning, second day, evening, morning, third day. The emphasis there, many will argue, the emphasis of the morning, the evening, the number yom, which is the word for day, is to emphasize a literal 24-hour day, to emphasize that. I would make the same case here. I would say that the reason that it's repeated 6 times is to say that to emphasize the literalness of it. Now, one thing I didn't get to is there are some people, not very common because it's a poor argument, there's some people that argue that he just says 1,000 because they don't have numbers bigger than 1,000, that's the biggest number they had. That's not true. They had a number 10,000. 10,000 was the biggest number that they had, you know, that they would use. So when they want to use a huge number, they'd say 10,000 times 10,000. Okay. 1,000 we have, but we have numbers that go up past 1,000, up to 10,000, and that's a bad argument to just say, well, it means a really big number. You know, based on that.
Like I should say anything. I just say like, well, I was thinking like, when the people think things aren't literal, then why would they think that the people who had been martyred? I mean, do they think that's not literally? They're not going to be literally resurrected and reigning.
Yeah. So you bring up a point with, we go back to Revelation 20. And this is one of the things, for the people that say this is a figurative thing, it references specifically, and I'm trying to look for the verse, the people who were killed for their faith during this time, beheaded. This is in verse 4. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Christ. And so, if that's still a future thing, he sees them before the 1,000 years, then the question then becomes that this 1,000-year period has to be some future thing. It couldn't have started with Christ. If it did, then the question becomes, who were these people that got beheaded for the name of Christ?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
And this is one of the arguments that I see with the amillennial position that's difficult, because if you see it as starting with the church age with Christ, now Jay was bringing up 70 AD, but 70 AD I don't think we see from Scripture other than that's when the temple was destroyed, and the temple being destroyed becomes the end of
Well, and that's where you and I would differ on the interpretation of the Olivet Discourse.
Yeah.
Because I believe that at least part of the Olivet Discourse was fulfilled in AD 70 with the destruction of the temple. So.
Oh, I think there was some, not maybe in the Olivet Discourse, but I mean, Christ did speak about the destruction of the temple. But the question becomes, who were the people that were beheaded before the 1,000-year period started? Now, if you go with 70 AD, maybe you can find some people to say that's who it was talking about. But since the Book of Revelation speaks to those people, you got to put all of that before that 70 AD. I definitely think 33 AD is going to be harder. And the reason 33 AD is going to be harder is because by that point nobody died for the cause of Christ at Christ's death, right? That came afterwards.
Got worse. So how could they think Satan was bound? I don't know. It just confuses me.
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue of Satan being bound and not being able to deceive, this is one area where I know for a lot of people they don't hold to amillennialism because of that one passage. Because if we're in this 1,000-year period now, then Satan has to be bound now, and can't be deceiving. And yet, we believe he is deceiving and roaring like a lion, seeking who he can devour currently.
And accusing against the brethren, right?
Yeah. Now there's differing views of how some handle that. I mean, some say that. I read one book where someone said that the 1,000 years was, and this was Augustine's view, that it was literal 1,000 years, and it's just he was in it. Some said that it was that first 1,000 years that Satan couldn't deceive. The problem I have with that is the Roman Catholic Church. I mean, like, really?
More than that, too. I mean,
the Roman Catholics, I see why they would argue for that, because they would say that it was until the 1500s with the Reformation. Then all of a sudden Satan was loosed.
Well, one passage they point to outside of Revelation that sort of gives support to the idea that Satan was bound and thrown into the pit at this point was John 12:31. Jesus is speaking to the Jews. I'm going to go ahead and start in verse 27.
Do that again. It's John what?
John 12:31, but I'm going to start in 27.
Good man.
So, now is my soul troubled. This is Jesus speaking, by the way. Now is my soul troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. But for this purpose I have come to this hour. Father, glorify your name. Then a voice came from heaven, I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again. The crowd that stood there and heard it said that it had thundered. Others said, an angel has spoken to him. Jesus answered, this voice has come for your sake, not mine. Now is the judgment of this world. Now will the ruler of this world be cast out. And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. He said this to show by what kind of death he was going to die. So, verse 31, now will the ruler of this world be cast out. They claim that the ruler of the world, tentatively, I would claim that the ruler of this world is Satan rather than rather than Jesus, because you have in Ephesians 2 where Paul describes the I can't remember the exact phraseology, but he said the prince of something.
Prince of the power of the air.
Yeah, him. So, just this idea that the ruler of this world was Satan in one sense, and then that Jesus was casting him out on the cross. So,
Well,
I don't know. What are your thoughts?
you get into
Casting him out of what, though?
What?
I was just casting him out of what, though? I mean, it's kind of vague.
Well, it said the passage said that he was just going to be cast out. It's true that it's kind of vague, but I'm not. I mean, cast out of the earth, cast out from heaven. Well,
and the interesting, I mean, so one of the things is, right, who is, when we say that, when this text says that Satan is the ruler of this world, is he?
in one sense.
Exactly. And that's the thing that gets kind of confusing, because in one sense he is the ruler of this world, but only because God lets him. So who's the real ruler? Well, it's God.
Yeah.
Right? Satan's not sovereign. God is. So now I'm just trying to look at the Greek here with this particular verb, cast out. So it's a future passive. Excuse me. Sorry. So this is something that's in the future that's going to happen to Satan, but the fact that it's an indicative, is kind of interesting, because what that ends up leading to say is that this is something that's just a statement of fact. Okay. And so the fact that he will be thrown out.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That ends up, I'm just trying to, I mean, that ends up bringing up this notion of that this is, I'm looking to see where else we have that, to see if there's anything more I can find from it. But where we have it is just that he's stating this as if it's a matter of fact. This is just what's going to happen. So I don't know. I'm not sure whether that's going to make the case that you want it to make as strong as you may want it.
Yeah. Maybe not cast out in the sense of thrown into the pit, even. I mean, it could be understood to just mean that Christ was going to take victory over Satan, and he wouldn't have power in the same sense that he, usually does. I don't know.
Yeah. This is the thing that you end up getting into studying some of this stuff. Sometimes you can get distracted by enjoying looking into some of the Greek here and stuff like that,
Mm-hmm.
which can become a distraction.
I've got my Nestle Island open. I just don't know any Greek, so it doesn't really help me.
Well, actually, what you want to do in this case is look at what's called the voice, tense, and mood, and some of that you'll see in some of those resources. But that's,
I was talking about physical book.
Yeah, you can see in there where it'll say it's a verb, it's future, it's passive, it's indicative, third person, singular.
In the actual printed edition of the Nestle Island?
It'll probably it should. Let's see.
No. It just has the Greek, and then it cites a bunch of textual variants. I know that Logos has the all of the lexical information and stuff like that, but
Yeah, I'm looking at that now. Okay.
But the verb is, I'm going to use modern pronunciation, so you're probably not going to recognize it. Ekvithesite.
Well, hold on. Let's have a little bit of fun here. Hold
Having
on.
fun.
Oh, I did it wrong here. Let me do it this way, and move this here. turn the volume up. Do that again.
Ekbalo.
There you go. Well, I just pronounced it for you.
Yeah, Ekbalo.
One of the nice things about Logos, right?
That's the same word, Baleen or Balain, is where we get hyperbole, the word hyperbole from, literally to throw over. So it means throw or cast, yeah.
The cross reference had about it says, therefore, since the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise also partook of the same, that through death he might render powerless him who had the power of death, that is the devil, etc. So rendering powerless is that was a cross reference.
I suppose it could be said that it's happened now, but it's not happened yet, sort of thing. The already not yet, that already Satan has been defeated by Christ, but he is still yet to be completely subdued.
One of the things that we often see with a future indicative, when it's God speaking, Christ, God, is sometimes he's speaking a son that even though it's still future to us, it's an absolute to God, so he can speak about it as if it's a past tense thing.
Yeah, well, it says noon or now, doesn't it? Now will the ruler of this world be cast out? So,
yeah.
Like, now I will go to the store, or like we're saying that this is happening now, but it's going to happen in the future.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and this is where sometimes sometimes not often, but there are times where some of these things become really important to go back into the original languages, especially with the Greek, because the Greek is a technical language, and some of that makes a big difference.
Yeah.
So, all right, so we'll probably end up wrapping up, unless anyone got some last minute questions, comments. I see, John just joined. I don't know if you were, John, if you were watching on YouTube the whole time. But
no, actually, I was going to say, like, what's this about? But,
we were talking about you most of the time.
Well, yeah,
but we saw you jump in, and we figured we'd stop.
Okay, thanks.
Well, the title of it was End Times Discussion. So we were talking mostly end times views and differing views, but then we kind of got in some views with differences with dispensationalism, covenant theology, and a couple other rabbit trails as rabbit trails happen to happen. That doesn't sound right, does it?
Yeah, I learned, basically, I went to John Corson's church down in Southern Oregon, and he taught pre-trib rapture when it comes to that kind of end times revelation, where he kind of taught where the book of Revelation was actually written in chronological order based on the verse of Revelations 1:19, where he says, write these things that were, that is, and the things that are to come. So even though he had a good sound theology when it came to teaching that, I'm still now on the fence on being pre-trib rapture and post-trib. And ultimately, it doesn't care. I don't care. God's in control.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing we definitely have to remember with this is that, we got to look at the fact that, God is the one who is not only in control, but when we examine this, we got to remember that we are looking still future. I like what one of my friends said. I meant to open with this, but I have a friend that explains the future prophecy like a political cartoon. If I gave a political cartoon, maybe this is a little dated now, but back like 50 years ago during the Cold War, of an eagle swooping down and grabbing a bear. Ooh, let's have some fun. Hi, Tim Hurd. How are you? Hey, Tim Hurd, guess what? You're
You.
well, you're on a live Google Hangout, Tim Hurd.
The one I'm watching.
Yeah, so I figured, I might as well answer this phone since you're calling, knowing that, because I do remember a time on Bible Thumping Wingnut where this happened to me, where you called me, didn't tell me I was live, but you knew you're live because you're watching.
You're live on Mixler right now. Also.
Oh, great. So you called to let me know you put this up on Mixler, huh?
Yeah, that's why I called. Oh, actually, I'm testing things, and some people showed up, and some of the people who are listening on Mixler are actually in your Hangout right now.
So I should also have a third chat room here, and that's the Mixler, the Bible Thumping Wingnut Mixler Hangout.
Yeah, John Wilkinson, he's in your Hangout. He's listed here also. Oh, actually, he bailed on me.
Yeah, I left earlier.
Actually,
He said he left earlier.
so he did it.
Yeah. So Tim is testing out some new equipment that he's recently got, new mixer, and so that's probably what he's doing out there on Mixler.
He was playing Striper earlier.
Yeah, that's about dispensational.
Well, John just said you were playing Striper, so playing this is a market improvement. Playing this Hangout is a market improvement to Striper. Just saying.
Playing both at the same time.
Yeah.
So Striper, discussing Striper over, future third-person indicatives, huh? I'm sure that goes well. I'm sure Striper usually gets into the Greek.
We have such a wide range of conversations here, don't we?
You should always tune in because you never know what may be happening.
Well, I tried getting into the Hangout last night, but my phone wasn't letting me.
Yeah, so you were trying on the phone. That's interesting. I meant that I was going to talk to Tim about this because several people had trouble getting into the Hangout last night on Bible Thumping Wingnut with Matt Slick.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that Tim had done was he did try a new way of doing the Hangout, which instead of going through Google Plus, going through YouTube. And so it was curious, and we did have someone who had trouble connecting tonight, and he usually connects to his phone. So are you connected to your phone tonight, Jay?
Not right now, no, I'm on my dad's laptop.
So Tim, I wonder if that becomes the issue. I wonder if you go through YouTube, if you can't connect to a phone, which may be interesting because when you connect to the phone, the moderator doesn't have controls to be able to, to mute people. And so Tim usually boots people if they come in that way, just so that they can't talk over Matt Slick or who's ever speaking and just be rude, because we know that professing atheists would never, ever do something like that. They would never be rude. Ever.
Well, it was after 10 o'clock, which would have been midnight your time, so.
Especially if a couple people are talking, somebody comes in, and they're going to interrupt the conversation. And they don't even realize they're doing it. So. Kind
of like when you call in here.
Yeah, well, you didn't have to answer.
Well, actually, so you were just planning on leaving me a message, huh?
I was just playing the call.
Well, we are glad that we can help Bible Thumping Wingnut test out the volumes of their call on a live show. So, but yeah, so Tim did do that once on the Bible Thumping Wingnut podcast, early podcast, maybe like number 2, 3, 4, something like that. Calls me and does not tell me they're live on the air.
Oh yeah, that was over a year ago.
That was a long time ago. All right, so I'm going to let you go, Tim.
All right.
So you can play. Thanks for calling.
go all night long here, or what?
No, we're not like Bible Thumping Wingnut. We don't go off air and then continue till 3, 4, 5 in the morning. I'm actually going to, end it pretty soon, and then, that'll end your testing, so you're going to have to go back to playing Striper.
It was 2 weeks in a row. This morning when I got up at 5 a.m., maybe 4:30 a.m., they were still talking on Mixler from the Hangout.
Yeah, I had to leave at about 2:30 or something. I was a zombie at that point.
Yeah, Vincent is saying he was a zombie at 2:30. I remember one of them I cut off about 4:30 in the morning. I left, and it was just Vincent and Vincent left in there. Not the Vincent that's here, but the other two Vincents. And I left at 4:30 in the morning from the Hangout, and they were still going. You said it's 6 in the morning, I think. You said they were still going. Insane. All right, Tim. I'll talk to you tomorrow. Bye. So with that, probably would have been a good place to kill the live feed about 3-4 minutes ago. I'm going to end the broadcast. Maybe we'll stay on, since we're on Mixler for a little bit, we'll stay up for a little while for those here who just want to chill and hang out, and I'll post a link, actually, to the Hangout in Mixler for anyone that wants to join. So there you go. So next, let's see, next week is what? I got to look to see if we're back on regular schedule. I may not have class next Monday night, just because of the holidays, and I'm just trying to look. I probably won't, just because the holidays, still trying to get some show prep. May just take a week off, last couple days left with my son while he is in town. But we will be picking up on the doctrine of the deity of Christ, answering world religions with that topic. So that will be on the next class that we have, which usually they're Monday nights, live, 8 o'clock Eastern Time. You can go to strivingforeternity.org, go to the Academy, click from there. You can go to the Watch Live Now. You can also be chatting live during that. We have our own chat there. So you can sign in, chat, watch it live. Until next time, remember to strive to make today an eternal day for the glory of God.